Hello, everyone, and welcome to our exclusive webinar on mastering pharmaceutical risk management and applying ICHQ 9 principles for success. I'm Jan Kugel, the Managing Director at Qualistry, and I'm delighted to be your main host today as we embark on a journey to explore the key elements of the pharmaceutical risk management. This webinar is brought to you in partnership with Qualio, a trusted and scalable EQMS software that makes quality easy. And my co-host for today will be Ashley Sherrick, a senior marketing manager at Qualio. And before we begin, I have to announce a slight change in our lineup. So due to an unforeseen private circumstances, Charlie Maxwell will be stepping in today instead of the originally planned speaker, Andrew Cole. So we are very grateful to Charlie for graciously accepting this role and joining David Cronin in sharing their wealth of knowledge with us. As I mentioned, we are privileged to hear from two distinguished speakers who bring a wealth of experience and expertise to our virtual stage. So our first speaker is Charlie Maxwell, the Managing Director and Consultant. And he is a QP and RP with more than 20 years of experience in manufacturing QA, regulatory compliance, batch release and distribution in the pharmaceutical and medical device industry. And he is the Managing Director of Orion GXP Consulting. And Charlie has been assisting his numerous clients with implementing phase-appropriate quality management systems, quality risk management, and much more. And our second speaker for today is David Cronin, the Chief Business Officer at Biotech Cognition Corporation. With an impressive career spanning over 30 years in the life sciences industry, David has dedicated the last 2 decades to enhancing IT data science models for pharmaceutical and medical device submissions. His expertise is structured content and data management combined with a profound understanding of industry standards and regulations. And he has significantly improved data integrity and chain of custody in product development and commercialization with his clients. David holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering and MBA from Northeastern University in Boston. And I'm really honored to have those two distinguished speakers with us today, and I'm confident that their insights will provide you immense value today. And without further ado, let's dive into the world of pharmaceutical risk management and learn how to make risk management a natural part of your product lifecycle. And at this point, I will give the stage to Ashley, the co-host for today, who will say a few things and will kick out the session.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you everyone for attending today. It's going to be a fantastic session. It seems like everyone already knows how to interact with us, but just in case, please type in your questions in the chat tab here. This is going to be a more casual style presentation where we are going to present with David and Charley, their industry expertise. However, when you do have a question, please feel free to put that in the chat and we will answer it throughout the flow of the presentation. So on today's agenda, we're going to start with the backgrounds and origins. Then we're going to go into managing risk. And lastly, we're going to be explaining and talking over how to apply a risk-based approach to your business. So as Jan has already said, on the next slide, just a quick informal information about Qualio. So who are we? Qualio is a cloud-based quality management software system designed specifically for life science companies. So we empower medical device, pharmaceutical, biotech, and contract organizations to get to market faster, boost revenue, and cut risk. You can use Qualio to embed and automate GXP, FDA, ISO compliance, and much more. And our global team is located around the world, including North America, Europe, and Australia. So we unite your teams, your processes, and data in a single source of truth that supports a culture of quality and makes your business that much stronger. We are easy to use, we are scalable, and we are fast to set up and always continuing to grow. So with that being said, we are going to pass on this next slide to Charlie so we can start talking about the background and origins.
So we're going to start off by talking about the backgrounds and the background and origins of quality risk management. So what exactly is, you'll hear QRM, you'll hear quality risk management, and you'll hear us talk about ICH-Q9 as well, which is kind of the backbone guidance, the International Committee on Harmonization guidance on how you conduct quality risk management. So just to give you a little bit of history, so we can't really talk about quality risk management in the pharmaceutical industry without looking at the main standard that we utilize. So that's ICH-Q9. So ICH-Q9 itself started off back in 2005. It was first introduced as the main standard for risk management within pharmaceuticals. It's also used in med devices. It's used in clinical settings. It's used across a number of segments of the industry. So it sets out the principles and introduces some of the tools that we can use to assure pharmaceutical quality. So the latest revision, ICH-Q9R1, was introduced last year and it tackled several deficiencies in the original text. So it now includes new chapters on formality and quality risk management, risk-based decision-making, and also on managing and minimizing subjectivity. And myself and David were just talking about this yesterday. We could probably do a whole webinar just on minimizing subjectivity. So, there's a whole plethora of information around that. So this new standard, it's not that new. It's been around for nearly 20 years at this stage. It's now well established and is a mainstay of European, US, and also other international areas such as PICS. It's a mainstay guidance document on compliance.
Charlie, what is the difference between the R1 and the old standard?
Yeah, so actually the main differences there were there were gaps. And a big thing is that minimizing subjectivity. So the new guidance will talk an awful lot about how we use set standards, how we will use qualitative measures and quantitative measures that are standardized and built into our processes. So it's just bringing a lot more maturity into our PQS or our quality management system in how we utilize risk management on a day-to-day basis. I don't know, David, have you anything to add on that? Or?
Well, one of the things from the original Q9 to the current R1 was also starting to add thoughts on product availability. That really wasn't something that I think was too much in the original. We won't be able to go into too much depth on what exactly that means for availability, but I would encourage everyone, get the standard. Buy the standard, read it. It's very well written and very clear. You can also look in 2020, I believe ICH put out a thing called the concept paper. It was the concept paper that they released before the official publication of the standard, and it very nicely delineates exactly what they anticipated the changes to be.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, availability, it's a big thing in pharmaceuticals as well. You have your supply chain, but you can't leave patients without their medicine. I mean, that's something that they've recognized.
A lot of standards I've noticed, FDA regulations and standards, right? They'll go through certain levels of churn for a while, then they settle down. It was many years between Q9 updates, right? So
absolutely, and it's the
things
same
change, technology changes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's that's fairly typical. You look at the standard and get so used to it, and then suddenly it's turned upside down. So why do we need risk management? Well, if you look at some of the headlines here, recalls for insulin pumps, recalls for a device due to damage during use that could harm a patient, thalidomide, we've all heard of that, I'm sure, at this stage. Thalidomide happened because nobody thought about, well, what are the risks of the wrong stereoisomer? What are the risks of genetotoxic, the damage that can do? and had, hopefully we would like to think, had we had the tools that we have now, someone would have looked at, well, what is the risk of that contamination, and the measures that we have in place now would have been carried out. So these are all the nightmare headlines that no company wants to have, and it's why we have quality risk management. And of course, there on the right you can see OxyContin, which was passed around like sweeties, as we know, and it's had anyone looked at that risk properly as well and said, maybe opioids shouldn't be given out so freely.
Yeah, just one other thing, Charlie, on that is that, from what I see working with the actual sponsors, is that over the last 10 years and even the last 5 and even the last 1 is a radical increase in the complexity of these products. For example, combination products are much more ubiquitous than they were 10 years ago. The drug and the device interaction, right? The complexity of large molecule development has really exploded over the last few years. The concept of cybersecurity has entered. That when Q9 was originally written, you didn't think of that. So there's a lot more just complexity, connected health, telehealth, all these things, and the pharmaceutical or biotech industry has to deal with a lot more moving parts than they did even a few years ago.
And we actually just got a great question in regards to the case for better risk management. When talking about risk management and supply chain, do the current drug shortages result from a weak supply chain risk management?
That's a tough one. I mean, from what I see dealing with different sponsors and CDMOs, is that some of it's just been disrupted supply chains, even post-pandemic, right? There's some of it's also driven by money, believe it or not. We've heard the story about the EpiPen person who bought the company and said, I'm going to multiply its price. We've heard, products being canceled just because they're not revenue generators. FDA in the United States has a thing called an orphan drug program to try to encourage people to get involved. So I don't think anyone's ever solved that. Answered. You may know more, Charlie, from your perspective.
It's funny you should mention EpiPens. I know of a particular case where there was a worry about the delivery of the drug from the EpiPen, and the regulator that was involved at the time had said, look, this is such a critical medicine, and if you withdraw it, or if you recall certain the batches or whatever, then we have no EpiPens for the patients. So the actual resolution from that potential recall was issue every patient with 2 EpiPens, and that way, if one doesn't activate, they chuck it and they get the next one. And that's the kind
Which may not be the ultimate way to deal with risk, but it's one way.
It was a short-term measure until obviously they had to go off and do other remediation work to fix the issue. But it sort of shows that the regulator were like, we just can't have you withdrawing this from the market carte blanche, Yeah.
So there's a lot of stressors in the industry now, whether it's increasing shareholder value, whether it's inflation in certain areas, whether it's shortages in certain areas, post-pandemic. So the whole shortage issue, I see it in me. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, which is really one of the life science capitals, if you think about it, globally. And there are people who are still having to hunt around for their different drugs. There are different inhalers going on and off market all the time. And I don't think we have one answer.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll press on to maybe to the next slide. So, what does risk management actually look like? I suppose, and we myself and Ashley and David were sort of racking our brains when we were coming up with this presentation. How would we demonstrate a really simple risk assessment? So we talk about there's 2 different techniques. There's qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative obviously involves numbers, where you do RPN multipliers, that kind of thing, like what we do with FMEA. Qualitative is more where we score something like low risk, medium risk, high risk, and we look at that across a number of critical questions. So we're going to give a little example here. So if we imagine we have a new product that we're introducing through a new product, an NPI process, and we're looking at 2 potential suppliers. So you'll see here, with supplier B and with supplier D. So it's a qualitative, what we have here is a qualitative composite scoring method that is both logical and avoids bias or manipulation, okay? So you can see here that we can put in the 2 suppliers down that first column, so supplier B and supplier D. I don't know why I didn't have A and B here, but it just so happens it's B and D. And then we we score them against 4 specific questions. So we look at where are they located, what type of material or service are they providing, is the end product sterile, biological, or non-sterile, and then who's going to be responsible for batch certification. So supplier B, you can see here, scores low risk for their location. They're in the EU, they're very highly regulated, so we would give that perhaps a low risk score. Material or service risk, so it's bulk manufacturing supply, so we might score that as medium risk. And then sterility, it's non-sterile, so we'll score that low as well. And you might score maybe medium risk or high risk if something's biologic or a sterile product. And then lastly, we have who is responsible for batch certification. So here we're saying they do that in-house. So we're scoring that maybe as medium risk. So overall, if you look at the scoring that we have across the bottom there, any high risk scores we'll score as high. Overall, 2+ medium risks we would score as medium. So that's what this one falls into, because we're a medium, if you see there, for question 2 and question 4. And low risk, we can only have 1 medium risk and everything else low. So if we look then at supplier D, they're high risk because they're a third country. Maybe it's manufactured in China, or so a country that's maybe not as highly regulated. Might be high risk for material service if it's end-to-end contracted out and there's lots of complexity in the supply chain. We might score that as high risk. We're still low risk because it's a non-sterile product. And who's responsible for batch certification? If they maybe subcontract that, we would score that as high risk again. So here we can see overall we would score high risk for supplier D. So it's a really simple scoring mechanism. And you probably find that you work in a company that maybe already has all of this. It's a flow diagram or something that's built into an SOP, and you don't realize you're actually using risk management, but you're using it as part and parcel of the process.
Charlie, how does this tie in with minimizing subjectivity?
That's a really good one, actually. So what I would expect is that you would have an appendix that would be linked to this, which would have really clear definitions of, you can only score low risk if they meet these predefined criteria. You can only score medium risk if they meet these other criteria. And let's take one of them here, supplier location. You can literally have a map of the world and say they're low risk if they're this, they're high risk if they're this, and anything in between is medium risk. And it eliminates all subjectivity then. So you might say the US, Canada, and Europe, that's low. Medium might be other developed countries, and maybe and Visa, for example, you might score Brazil, you might score certain countries medium, and then everything else is high risk. And that way, a person who comes and takes your checklist or takes your risk scoring, there's no subjectivity at all. It's not always that easy, when you come to FMEAs and that, and there's a really ambiguous question. Sometimes you just have to use best judgment. You maybe have to use a committee mentality and ask a few people within your organization and come to a consensus.
I agree with Charlie.
Jump in on that?
I agree with you, Charlie, what you're saying. Even when you mentioned the more detailed risks like an FMEA, some people used to talk about what's state of the art, or do we have proof of this supplier working with us in the recent past that we've done an audit on, a quality audit. So this all more justifications, right? So there can be a lot in that. When Charlie said there might be an appendix, that could be a pretty detailed appendix about the why, the rationale. It's not just because they are located in Ireland, but it's because we've used them repeatedly for many years, and we just did a quality audit 6 months ago. That's why we're confident in the low. So yes.
Yeah.
And then we actually did have another question on this. Shouldn't subjectivity, besides definitions, also be mitigated by evaluating real data?
Part of what I was saying a little bit is that in this particular example, if you're working with suppliers or third parties, some of the data may be, have we worked with them before on a similar product? Have we done a quality audit? Are they using Qualio, high quality software for their QMS, right? Are they meeting the standards, and have they proven it in the recent past? You know, this is when you start to actually get more of a little bit more of a data type approach.
Yeah, and your due diligence as well, David. So yes, you're looking at supplier. You're not only going to ask these 4 questions. You're going to go off and do due diligence on them. You're going to look at, have they had any FDA warning letters? Have they, have they had recalls in the last 5 years? That's the real data essentially, Ashley, that you would be feeding into this. I just have oversimplified here for the purposes of, you could have 10 questions, and you could have they had any warning letters? Have they, absolutely. That would make perfect sense. All right. So David, I think you were going to talk on managing risk. Is that correct?
Sure, I'll jump in a bit here.
Sorry.
Okay, so if we look at this slide, and we see what is risk, combination of probability of occurrence of a harm and the severity, that's great. I figure we'll dig in for a couple of minutes about kind of a little bit more what that really means. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is a nice example provided to us by Ashley. Before I read it, when Charlie introduced Q9, just keep in mind that a Q9 applies at many different levels within the organization, right? So there's business risks, development, regulatory, clinical trial oversight risk. There's packaging and labeling risks. There's stability risks. There's risks on supply chain and the actual manufacturing process. So there's a lot of areas where risk is applied. What we're trying to do here is kind of back it down to some of the most fundamental nuggets, if you will. And people like to use this example a lot, right? Chicken crossing the road. Well, they wanted to get across the road to the other side. So what's the potential risks, right? Now, this is just one. It's meant to give you a simple idea. Well, they could be hit by a car. Well, that's a risk. And of course, you might say, well, how severe is that? Did they get killed? Did it was just a minor inconvenience, right? Etc. Well, how do we assess how likely is it to happen? Is it a busy highway with lots of cars coming? Is everybody on their phones texting? And well, what can we do about that? Well, should we have traffic lights at these crossing locations with the zebras or the pedestrian walkways, or should we remind people to look? When I go to London, I always have to look left or right. And why am I looking that way, right? I come from Boston, right? So if you start to think about this simple example, it actually does work, because it gives us a chance to say, well, how fast can I run across the street? And is it foggy that day? And if I put in certain types of traffic controls, could they themselves add even additional new risks that weren't there before? So you can go to the next slide. So point being, can get complicated. So in the next slide we have here, which is something we took from ISO 14971. Now, that's a medical device standard from ISO. It's actually application risk management to med devices. You say, why we bring that up? Because I think this diagram from Annex C actually really gives you a good feel for, what does risk mean at its core. And if you kind of look at the top, you'll see hazard. Okay, there could be this thing called a hazard that exists. From that hazard, there may be a series of events, right? There may be some things that happen, right? A sequence of events, some things, people say circumstances that happen that may lead to or expose a hazardous situation, another buzzword. And that hazardous situation now may be present. And then from there may be additional sequences of events or circumstances or things that could happen that may lead to an actual harm occurring. Now here we're thinking of about a person being harmed, but remember, this doesn't have to actually be a person, but thinking person. So if you look, you say, okay, hazardous situation, harm. So what is the risk? Well, the risk really is, you see the dotted box at the bottom. The risk is really a combination of, well, how likely is it that that harm happened? Well, it's a probability that the hazard exposed a hazardous situation. Maybe they call it a P1. And the probability that a hazardous situation led to a harm, maybe they call it a P2. So I have this overall probability that the harm occurs. I also have the severity of the harm. Chicken could be killed outright. Chicken could be just drop the grocery bag and scared, right? So the harm might be 5 death, 1 minor inconvenience. So when we look at the harm with its probability of occurring, with its severity, that's what we think of as the risk. If we go to the next slide quickly, we'll try to give a kind of a somewhat simple but meaningful example. This actually comes from another med device standard, sorry, but they do it pretty well, 24971, which is sort of a guide for 14971. So if you look at this, I hope you can all read it, but at the top, you'll see hazard. Now, maybe this is something you're dealing with electricity, right? The hazard is that there's electricity out there. And the situation might be, the hazard situation may be that we have active line voltage, 220 volts AC, right? Okay, that's a potentially hazardous situation. And what's a potential harm? That someone gets zapped, right? So I'm not going to read this whole diagram, but it gives you a really, really good feel for it, that there's this hazard of electricity in something, and there may be events or circumstances that occur, and that's where you see the A, B, C, D. Hey, maybe the insulation has been frayed or cracked over time on this wire, and maybe a piece falls off, and then maybe someone is reaching in to do maintenance and touches it, right? So you can see that these events or sequences may lead to these probabilistic multipliers, that the situation occurs where a person is exposed to the line voltage. And after that, now, okay, what might be the harm? You can see, well, it might be, ouch, minor harm. It might be, oh, they got a burn mark on them, or they might be killed. So this is where you can, when someone asks about some of the numeric stuff, semi-numeric, right? But I can assign numbers to these probabilities. How do I know that? Because we've done it before, because we've looked at the state of the art, because we've looked at examples of predicate products that are on the market, because we've reviewed the scientific literature, because we've tested it ourselves. And we can start to build up this more of a probabilistic model of what is the chance or likelihood that something bad happens. And of course, that's going to lead later to what are we going to do about that to reduce the likelihood. You can go.
And actually, we do have a quick question on this one in regards to this, what you're just talking about, David. Should we add detectability, meaning our ability to detect the risk in a timely manner to act?
That's a very good question. See, I don't want to digress too much, but in the med device industry, there's a standard 14971 about risk management, and it never mentions the word failure or FMEA in it. It says hazard situation, harm. And then I walk into a company and I say, we're doing our FMEA, and the second row has a hazard. So FMEA was traditionally created by actually automotive and other guys for reliability analysis, and not necessarily hurting people, losing money, or that the alternator would wear out sooner than we wanted in our Ford truck. And over time, it's going to kind of blended in. So when we see FMEAs and hazards, so I don't want to get caught up in the words, but the short answer is totally legitimate to include detectability. This is just not the diagram for it.
Great. Thank you, David. We can continue on.
And detectability, just so you know, is not that they detected someone died from the electricity. It would be, did we detect a possible fault condition before things got bad, right? Okay.
So do you want to talk?
I'll have to jump again. Just a, quick note again. So this is a little example about documentation, right? If you see how it's all about making, creating documents that are good and accurate, right? Whenever we're doing risk, at least when I'm doing risk, I tend to do it a little bit deeper, right? Not at the high business level, but a little more in the development level. There's an understanding that we're trying to account for what we'd expect a normal intended use is, or what do we expect people to be doing, and then also what we would want to account for is what we would consider reasonably foreseeable misuse. So that's, if someone picks up a scalpel, goes in the street and stabs someone in a robbery, that's not reasonably foreseeable misuse. We don't have to account for that in risk. But if somebody here in this documentation process might have been colorblind or might have been overburdened with work by their quality team, and they didn't have the time, or they misplaced something, or they typed something wrong, we would want to account for that, right? So here we're just looking at a very simple example that, hey, if we have these reports that we need to get done, and you see the green box, they're usually done. I mean, a low probability that they are not done. And if they're not done on time, or if they're not available right away, it's not that bad. The severity is low. Hey, we want you to get them done well and on time. If they're not always exact, well, you're usually pretty good, low probability. And even if you miss it, it's not going to kill us. So that's what we mean by that green rectangle. And as you can imagine, the diagonal rectangle with the red would say, well, if we actually have bad stuff in there, wrong data or false information, incorrect labeling, or whatever it might be, you might say, hey, that's really bad if that happens, because it'll lead to potential harm. And in this case, we might say that happens a lot. Oh, I don't like that. Right? It's really bad, and it happens a lot. So that's why you see the super red there, right? And the other two yellows are kind of self-explanatory, right? They were saying, hey, if the lower right, if there's a contamination due to bad packaging, that's pretty severe, but it rarely happens, so it's a low probability. So the gist of this, though, is that, what should you color red, green, and yellow? And how finely should you cut this up? Is 4 boxes enough? Should it be 44 boxes? Can anything ever be green? I know a lot of companies, there's no such thing as green in risk. It's yellow is the best, right? And do we go as low as reasonably practical? How far do we have to go until we say we've covered this? And we'll get to that.
Yellow, amber, and red, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
David, would you say that so when you talk about severity is kind of the given, and then we can introduce controls that can have an impact on occurrence and detectability. But severity of, if you get hit with that 220 volts, that's going to stop your heart, that's always going to be severe. That's always going to be high. Is that, would that be I just saw it come up in the questions. People were asking about, can you change the severity? So maybe give your thoughts on that.
So that's another. These guys are good. These guys and girls are good today.
Yeah,
yes,
we have a lot of questions on this slide. So that was just a few of those that Charlie was mentioning. So we could stay on this slide for a whole nother hour.
Yeah, I don't want to claim expertise.
Yeah.
I don't want to claim to be the expert here. So in general, as Charlie said, that if the guillotine falls and cuts your head off, you'll die. I can't change the severity of death to be just minor, right? So if you're going to be killed, you're going to be killed. So normally we would see most risk activities say that I'm dealing with ways to reduce the probability of occurrences of things.
That's right.
Because I can't affect the severity. There are some rare cases in some companies that will sometimes do that in certain areas. And I think that's beyond the scope of today. So in general, I would say most people are dealing with, how do I reduce the likelihood of someone getting electrocuted? As opposed to, how do I reduce the likelihood that they don't get, that the severity is lower? So a big topic.
Yeah, we'll try to get back to some of these questions more specifically at the end of the presentation. So we'll continue on, but there's a lot of good ones. So
Sure. Very good. So the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about what risk management is and isn't. I think this is a kind of a tag team between both of us, David. Really, it's to me, risk management is using all of the information you have available to you within your organization, from quality management reviews, from your tracking and trending of your events, from complaint data, all of this, and then using that information and using that data to try to mitigate the risks within your organization, and to always be improving, always be driving for better standards.
I agree with you. Yep, I would say the big thing that I see out there is that it's not a one-time thing. You don't do that FMEA, you don't do that risk thing, sign it and put it into the folder and be done. It is a continuous process. I think I saw someone who signed on said they do stability. Well, when I submit my product for the health authority for my BLA or whatever application, I have this big stack of things, and then there is a lot of stuff about drug stability. Is this going to still be good a year later? Fine. Well, guess what? There's a thing called an annual product update or annual product review. So even on market, I have to update and say, yes, my process is still continuing to make this paracetamol good for 1 year or 2 years, whatever the shelf life is. So I think a big thing to take away is that it's a continuous process and not just do it and be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with that being said, we do have a question on how do we decide qualitative or quantitative risk analysis for a specific hazard?
I might jump in on that, David, first, if you don't mind. I think the formality, there's a little sentence in ICH Q9 that says the formality should be commensurate with the severity of the risk. So if you're looking at, some slight document omissions, or maybe people miswriting the date when they're maybe writing, they're not writing 2024 when they're writing the year on a document, that isn't going to kill anybody, So you're probably looking at, very, very light, and you may just come up with a rationale saying that, the risk is minimal and we're just going to do retraining. Whereas, something that might require, that might be patient critical, you're going to introduce more formality. And that's where you start getting from risk statements or risk acceptance statements into quantitative risk assessments. And then the more severe you get, the more you're getting into, no, we want actual data. We want to go off and measure stuff. We want to test. We want to do, full-blown quantitative risk assessments, right. Potentially FMEAs. Yeah. David, your thoughts?
Yes, keep in mind again that a hazard doesn't have a severity. When we said, voltage exists, it's the harm that has severity. And if you're saying I want to start to numerically calculate the probabilities of these things connecting, whatever, I'll give you an example. I think I'll try to simplify. Imagine you're making sutures, for sewing, people after an operation. And when you're predicting, hey, hopefully they snip it pretty close at the end so the string's not all sticking out in you, right? You don't necessarily have numeric ways to calculate how often that happens, right? But once it's on market, you start to monitor your complaint system or your field feedback, and then you will see companies start to say, hey, 1.3 times 10 to the -5 occurrence that the surgeon fails to snip with less than 1 millimeter. And then they'll start to add some numeric. So the same thing as Charlie is saying is that the more dangerous the risk is overall, then the more you want to go numeric. But you can't always have a number, which is why you're looking at state of the art. You're looking at the literature. You're looking at predicate products in the market. You're looking at your previous experience, and sometimes it's the justification or rationale or what we call the benefit risk assessment that's the most powerful. All the little calculations before are nice, but then the health authority says, why should I believe this? Because we've done it 500 times before, exactly the same way, and this is the results we got.
And David, and both of your examples that you just provided it seemed to be that there are products already on the market. And we did have a question in regards to, can detectability be scored in a risk assessment for a new process, or can it only be scored once the process is in place and reviewed? So kind of getting ahead of risk assessment.
Yeah. I always see it scored at the beginning with a new process because you have to do it. And it's a little more than putting your finger for the wind direction. It's usually people don't come into a new process where every person is brand new and the entire process is brand new. So you have to build on the experience you have, build on other examples that other companies have done that may be similar, and you just have to grow it over time. And this is some of the stuff I think that Charlie helps people with every day is how do I go through that process where at the beginning it's greenfield and I don't know a lot, but I got to get some things down, right, Charlie? And
It's the old subjectivity chestnut again, isn't it? It's pretty subjective because you don't know it, but you have other products, you've worked in other companies who've had similar products, and there's maybe literature out there. You've just got to take what data you have, and it might be people will probably kill me for saying this, but it might just have to be your best guess, but it has to be scientifically based. And you have to be able to stand over, well, why did you come up with that number? Why did you say you're scoring it at 6 or you're scoring it at 3?
Yeah, and the process of making a new drug or biologic is being tested. Obviously, you don't just produce it and sell it. So even well before the BLA or whatever application you're doing, you're going to have gone through this risk many times, because you didn't just do it once. You'll have started. You'll have done some testing. You might have made a small clinical batch. You might have learned from that. You might have scaled up a little bit, learned from that, tech transfer, commercialize, et cetera.
Yeah. So
we have like 20 other questions on this, so this is great. They just keep rolling in. But let's talk about this slide next, and then we'll jump back into a few questions that are coming in.
Yeah. So this one is, well, what isn't risk management? And again, the three of us had a great talk about this yesterday, where companies are like, let's do a risk assessment so we can justify some crazy commercial decision. We want to only go with a certain formulation, or we only want to go with a certain strength, and the patient has to take double the amount, or we should never use risk management for those types of things. It should never be just a compliance exercise. We've hit a threshold on complaints in the market, so we have to do a risk assessment, but we're going to give the score at the start, and we're going to work backwards. That's absolutely not what we should be using risk management for. You have to be completely objective. And you have to say, okay, let's put all of the data in, and whatever it gives us at the end, that's our answer. Shouldn't be an excuse for lapsed compliance either, and shouldn't be just a solo exercise, a paperwork tick box exercise that I have to do a risk assessment, so I'll do it in 20 minutes, and we'll put it into this deviation, and then we'll close it out. Otherwise, what's the point in doing it? And definitely, I love this big box across the bottom left. It shouldn't be an explanation for there isn't enough time, there isn't enough money, or there isn't enough people. So we'll just risk it out. We'll say we can do this without without a statutory position, or we'll get somebody who's not trained in that particular role to do that, because we have deemed it to be low risk. David, do you want to add your thoughts on it?
Well, I'd say two things. I've seen many examples. I saw an example with a sponsor who had a product on the market in the United States, $1 billion a year. Go to another country, predicted, estimate another $1 billion for that market revenues. They had errors in filings that had to do with process risk, that they didn't fully identify, and it was like a 90-day delay in the filing. That is $250 million of lost revenues that never came back. What do you think that the shareholders felt about that? Because you're not just answering to the health authorities. And other examples are, and you can look these up, there have been executives in the life science industry actually jailed in the United States, because as a management representative, if you're looking at quality overall, management sign-off, management responsibility, if they haven't clearly done it and they can't prove that people have delineated the processes, followed the processes, and continually worked to improve the processes, people have actually become criminally and civilly liable for money and freedom. So risk management is not just do it because Q9 says do it.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide then. Mm-hmm. So, if anyone has an SOP at all on quality risk management, there'll be an appendix or an addendum or a table, or somewhere in your QRM SOP, you're going to have this diagram. This is directly out of the I think it's within the first scrollable part, certainly, of ICH Q9. And it kind of demonstrates, if you see the sort of back and forth arrows where there's loops, risk reduction, if it's unacceptable, you go back into risk assessment. Likewise, if you do risk review and something's unacceptable, well, you go back up into risk control. It should demonstrate that risk management is an ongoing, all the time process. It's never ending, You're always risk mitigating. You're always, if you've got the right quality culture and you're driving for continuous improvement, you should be using this tool, to always drive for continuous improvement. So, I've done a risk assessment. I've identified the hazards and the risks to do with my product. I've done risk control. I've reduced those. That's great. We've reviewed it. We've reviewed the outputs. Feed it all back in again. Keep driving for more. Keep reducing those risks. But, we're only going to stop doing quality risk management when there are no risks at all, and that ain't going to happen either.
Absolutely. So we do have a few questions I'd love to answer right now. One of them just came in saying, how does the risk assessment process in QRM identify and prioritize potential risks to product quality and patient safety? I'm going to read that again.
Yeah, just go one more time, Ashley. Sorry.
Sure. No worries. How does the risk assessment process in QRM identify and prioritize potential risks to product quality and patient safety?
I guess I'll jump in first, David, if you don't mind. There's two ways. If you're doing a prospective risk assessment, you map the process, and then you go, okay, step one is get all my materials out. You then ask yourself the question, well, what could go wrong? I could mix up two raw materials. I could contaminate one of the raw materials, which maybe has to be kept sterile, and so on and so forth. And then for each of those, well, what's the impact of that? What actually is the hazard? What's the failure mode? What's the end result? The severity essentially is what you end up with for that. If it's retrospective and you're starting to look at, say, complaints coming in from the marketplace, that's slightly different. You're looking at data and you then hit a signal where you say, actually, we're getting too many problems where this actuator on this EpiPen isn't triggering. It's 0.01 or what. I think I can't remember the number you quoted earlier, David, but that trigger
very low. Yes.
It's very, very low. It's going to be very low because if an EpiPen doesn't work, you're into anaphylaxis, so that's not good. I don't know if that answers the question, Ashley. David, if you want to jump in, feel free.
Well, just so you know, Ashley and Charlie, you remember right near the very end of these slides, we have a couple of examples, one about patient risk and one about process risk. So when we get to those, I chat a little if they want a little more detail. About those two specific things, patient and process.
So we'll ask just one more question before we go into the next slide. What was the basic need for revising the ICH Q9 guideline for QRM, and how has it affected the pharmaceutical sector in terms of quality of medicines and formulations?
Charlie addressed a good amount of that near the beginning right, Charlie, when you talked about trying to move away from a subjective approach, start talking more about product availability and clarity on decision making. Some of the explicit reasons why they did with the REV, and then we spoke about how, in general, we've had more complexity, not only in the molecules, but in the products with combination and connected and things like that. And the standard as it was written previously just didn't account for as much of that as it needed to.
Yeah, exactly that. And I mean, previously in companies, you would have heard words being banded around like rarely. We don't feel that this will. This may not. And that's no longer acceptable. The data shows that the The CPK value is 1.4. Therefore, we believe, therefore the process is shown to be good. You have to be much more scientific now. All that subjectivity is removed. And what I'm finding is that the regulators now are going back to ICH-Q9 and saying, no, we've actually brought this in. It's now in ICH-Q9. You can't use terms like "we feel that." It's our understanding that, or it's that we haven't seen evidence for this happening. You can't just use those really objective, poor, non-scientific justifications anymore when you're writing risk statements, or when you're looking at risk review and what's the conclusion or outcome from your risk assessments.
Great, thank you. I guess, we can move on because some of these questions I know will be answered in the next coming slides. So
perfect. So the next thing we're going to talk about was, okay, so we've talked a little bit about theory, and we've introduced you to the standard, what ICH-Q9 looks like, and we've shown you the little diagram and everything. But what does this mean for us all working in the pharma and medtech industry? How do you apply risk-based approaches and risk-based decision-making into your everyday decision-making in your business? So here we have a quote: risk management can only be effective if it is integrated into all business processes. Dr. Alexander Jacqueline. So that's really, really true, if it's new product introduction, if it's stability, if it's if it's clinical development, right throughout the entire life cycle of your product and all of the business process and everything that goes with that, we should be looking at risk. We should have a centralized risk register within our companies, and we should be really always, through either monthly reviews or whatever, going after, okay, what are our top risks? And it's that sort of 80-20 rule, that Pareto rule. If I'm chasing those 20% that are causing the most problems, I'll always be getting better year on year. Okay, to move to the next slide, or did anybody want to talk about that?
I think we covered communication.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So risk communication, I suppose, is the next thing we're going to talk about.
And Charlie, I think we did cover that. I think we're on the next. Am I right, Ashley?
No, I think this is the next slide.
Oh, okay. I thought we had spent time on communication. All right.
No. This was before some of the headings around.
Got it. Sorry. Yep.
No worries.
Just looking. No, I'm happy.
So for risk communication, decision makers and other parties should communicate at every stage in the process. So, this could be your regulator. So this could be the FDA or the MHRA, stakeholders, patients as well. You're going to get feedback through complaints. You're going to get feedback from physicians, that kind of stuff. And, all of your communication should be fed into your risk management system. So that can be facilities and people. It can be organizational. It can be process. It can be product. These will all feed back into your communication strategy. Any questions on that?
So there is one question. So this is a huge document. I know we're going to be going more in detail in the next coming slides. This is a huge area of focus. So where should we start?
If you're talking about like a greenfield kind of application and it's a new company, and where do we start? So to me, I suppose you're designing products, you're designing facilities, and you're designing the manufacturing processes itself. You're going to have mapped out processes, so you can do prospective risk assessment on that. You can say, okay, what is the process for running this bioreactor? You'll have a flow diagram. You can then take that and break it down into a prospective FMEA. And you should start building up your risk register right from the beginning. As soon as you're mapping out processes, you're at a step. Okay, it's the first, perspective. It'll be Rev 1 of that process FMEA risk assessment, but it's definitely the first step. And as you start to use that process in anger, you keep revisiting that process FMEA. Remember, an FMEA is not something you do. You sign it off and then you throw it in a cabinet to gather dust. It's something that you should have out. It should be there. It should be used all the time. So we've tweaked something in the process. We have introduced new valves, or we've introduced a new interface. Okay, pull out the risk assessment. We need to go back through it again, and we need to rescore. David, any?
Yep. Following along with process, I agree. Communication. You're thinking process risk in this case. It's typical that a company early on will have a risk management plan. So how am I going to define acceptability for this process? What does it mean? What are potential critical quality attributes that I need to be sure are happy by the time the product comes out of the facility? How do I know which critical quality attributes might be really critical versus not critical? Scientific literature, research, experience, right? So that's what Charlie's saying, is we're building up over time. Just sticking with the process engineering risk. Do I follow a recipe for this? What are the process parameters in that bioreactor? What are the material attributes? What are the sensitivities of those things? So some of this can get very, very technical, and not everyone that does I-9 is doing detailed process or manufacturing risk, right? Some people are doing facilities risk, some people are doing clinical trial oversight risk. It's just that what we're showing here is that the concepts are all the same, but you're going to find, depending on where you end up, very different nomenclature, very different discussions about what does red mean. But if you learn the fundamentals, you'd be able to cut through all of that, the jargon, so to speak, and realize that they're still all trying to say how sensitive. If this thing wiggles here, how bad does it make that wiggle, right?
Communication is key. All right, so we will continue on the next few slides. I won't ask any additional questions just because it's heavy. We do have about 30. We are right at the 1 hour mark, so we have 30 more minutes. So we are fine on timing, but do want to save some extra time at the end for some more Q&A. So excellent. I will let you guys speak and continue on.
No problems. So yeah, the next slide is assessment. This is the meat and potatoes, if you like, of any risk management process. It's the risk assessment part itself. So you're doing an FMEA, you're maybe doing maybe some sort of cumulative scoring mechanism. You might be doing a qualitative risk assessment. But you start by looking at identifying your hazards, analyzing the risks, and then doing your risk evaluation. So, what is hazard identification? Well, what can go wrong? If you map out your process in your FMEA, then it's like you take that step in the process. What could go wrong with that? A liner in a single-use bioreactor, it might tear. So that's one hazard. You then follow that train of thought through. What control mechanisms do you have in there that reduce the occurrence? What detection mechanisms are in there? How would you know if that had happened? Similarly, if you were doing PUPSIT on a sterile filter. So sorry, you're using a 0.2 micron filter. So one of your hazards could be, well, that filter might rupture. How would you know? Well, you do PUPSIT testing, you do bubble point testing on it before and after. So we also look at the likelihood or probability of it going wrong. Do we have data on that? Do we have data from the manufacturer on that filter? How many times has it ever failed in their experience? Have we ever had a failure from it in our organization? And then what are the consequences of if that goes undetected through the system and it leads to, ends up in the hands of the patient. You'd have non-sterile product, that's pretty severe if it's something that you're wanting to inject into cancer patients, so that kind of thing, so yeah. Risk assessment, map your process, identify your hazards, and then look at, right, okay, what's the severity of that hazard and what's the probability of it going wrong? And, how do we detect it? That's your SOD, if you like, from your FMEA. David, any examples from you or anything?
Nope, I agree. Earlier, we showed a couple of schematic slides from 14 and 24,971. That's examples of beginnings of risk assessment, and Charlie listed others. Somebody mentioned patient risk, product risk assessment. Maybe you need to do the human factors risk, right? The interaction of the person with the product, right? So that might be, people call that a UFMEA, or a use case analysis. So the assessment is really whatever tools and techniques needed depending on the type of risk you're looking at. It may be a pure hazard analysis, it may be some sort of control strategy, etc.
Yeah. Okay. Quantitative versus qualitative. So you've in the example that I gave of the 2 different suppliers, that was quantitative. Sorry, that was qualitative. My apologies. So that's where you're not scoring them with a number, you're just scoring them with a low, medium, high. And it uses qualitative uses descriptors, so high, medium, low. You may see other terms used, but they're very typical in the industry. You do have to have definitions behind that, though. You have to have a table of, well, what exactly is low? So that you're not, and that was one of the criticisms of the old standard, was we were allowed to just say something was medium risk, or medium severity. We didn't have to justify that. Now we do. Now we have to go, well, it's medium because it's not going to kill the patient, so it's not high, but it's not trivial either. It's not something that's just going to cause a minor inconvenience, so we're scoring it as medium. Quantitative is real data. That's where we have numerical probabilities. So we have placed 1 million of these units on the market, and we've received 35 complaints. And that equates to 0.0 whatever. I'm not going to finish that because somebody will be out with the calculator telling me your numbers are wrong. It's useful for one particular consequence at a time. So if it's the EpiPen that doesn't actuate, that's the whole point of you having an EpiPen, is it delivers that drug. If it doesn't do it, that's probably all you're going to be looking at there, really. And it requires quite a substantial amount of empirical data. So you do probably need to have, and I mean, this is the whole purpose of pharmacovigilance. It's looking for those signals and measuring, how much, how much of the adverse events, if you like, are happening on the market. Any questions on that? No? We'll move on.
We definitely have some questions, but we have a good amount, so we'll go through a few more slides and save them towards the end.
Sure. I'm not quite sure about this slide.
I mean, the way I looked at that is someone, we have maybe this upper threshold we won't accept higher, maybe, right? So if this is some sort of risk score, I think that it's interesting, Charlie, because I've seen real examples, and I'll just trying to think of a cauterization, right? Imagine you're cauterizing a wound, with heat, right? You're going to stop the nosebleed, or you snip the polyp in the colonoscopy and you zap it. So, hey, we do that for hemostasis to stop the bleeding. Well, what is the risk? It burns healthy tissue around there. So, okay, how much are we willing to tolerate that, right? Is there a level, right? So what is the appetite? How delicate or precise is this operation? Or when I say operation, it doesn't have to be on a person, right? And where will I accept these? remember,
I follow what you're saying now, and
yeah,
what we're getting at is, so that you don't have a moving goalpost, you should really define, well, what am I willing to accept? What am I not willing to accept? And we should define
yeah,
that ahead of time and
yep,
then stick to our guns and not say, well, we're not going to move that goalpost because we're seeing a drift and we're seeing more and more of
hmm
a particular issue occurring. So we're going to be a little bit more flexible and we're going to accept a little bit more a higher
absolutely.
level of failure in the marketplace because we don't want to get into a recall situation. No, you have to define that up front and and then have the appetite, I guess, to stick to your guns and say,
Yep.
no, that's what it is.
And I'll bring up that evil word again, money, uh, for this. And Charlie, you used the phrase CPK before, your process capability, right? Well,
Yep.
I'll just make sure that all of my tolerances, my upper and lower, are touching. So we're going to make everything cost $1 trillion, to make it so precise, right? So the
Yeah.
reality is that everything has risk, and we're maybe a bit premature to say this, but Q9 is not saying you shall eliminate risk. That's not possible. It's saying you shall manage risk. And as we get closer to the end, we'll see what we mean by that, right? So when you say, what's
Yeah.
your appetite? Believe it or not, your appetite is also based on staying in business while having safe and efficacious products.
Absolutely. Analysis pre-mitigation. So I think this slide we're talking here about where you have multiple risks and those amber risks that are on the top of the line there that we want to. Sorry, David, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Did you want me to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just not sure what this
Okay.
slide.
Well, I mean, if I look at the last slide where you had, this kind of this range that you felt for happiness between those two horizontal lines, I've done some of my risk assessment. I've done those FMEAs and U's and hazards and all that, and I see a bunch of these red or orange things. They're outside. The risk is too high for us right now, right?
Sure.
Right now, based on everything we do today, the way we know today, what we predict, how we're going to design the facility, whatever, some of these things are not happy. So we're probably going to have to do something about that to what we call control the risk, or to lower those circles lower to get into the range we want. And of course, the green one at the bottom, somebody might say you're wasting money there because you got that so well. You can be more sloppy with that because it's extra good. So the main thing to look at, I think, and this is the orange ones, right? That, hey, I've done my analysis and here's where I'm at. And those things that are orangey color mean that the risk is higher than we believe will be acceptable. So what are we going to do about that?
Yeah, so when you get into mitigation, you're going after the right risks, essentially. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I understand it now. So the next one is control. So this is where we get into mitigation. This is where we get into, okay, so now we've put a value on those. We've got those 5 or 6 amber ones that we want to do something about. We're maybe not going to do something about the green one. So what are we going to do about those amber ones? And the idea is to try and reduce the risk to an acceptable level, but the effort should be proportional to the significance of the risk. So if it's going to, if it's the EpiPen not actuating, or if it's the lightning or if it's the 220 volt bare cable, that might kill someone. So those are the risks we want to go after. We are always going to focus on, is the risk above an acceptable level? So is there a chance that that's going to harm a patient? One time out of every 10, that's not acceptable. We have to do something about that. Can we actually do something to reduce or eliminate the risks? I mean, sometimes it may be a case of you've just injected someone with a syringe, and it's contaminated, and there's a needle there. Until that goes into the sharps box, there's a danger of a needle stick injury to a nurse or a doctor. Can you do much about that? Not really, unless you have the needle magically disappear the minute the drug's delivered, which there aren't. I don't believe there's products like that out there. There are products that deliver the drug through the dermal layer, and you don't have those sharps, but they're pretty cutting edge, and a lot of our parenteral drugs are delivered using a needle. So can we actually eliminate that risk completely? No, we can't, but what can we do to reduce it? Can we have some sort of retraction mechanism? Can we have something that covers the needle, shields the healthcare worker, so they're less likely to get a needle stick injury from that? That's the kind of things we'd be looking at. And then there has to be an appropriate balance between benefit, risk, and resources. We could spend tens of millions of dollars developing a fancy shield that when you deliver that drug, it's going to have a clamshell that goes over the needle, but it means that your syringes are going to be I'm from Europe, so I'm going to say euros here. It's going to be €1,000 per syringe. That's not going to fly either, because it's not economically possible. And the other thing is, are new risks introduced as a result of risk control? You could develop that wonderful clamshell mechanism that hides the needle the minute the drug is delivered, but in 20% of the cases that fails, and you can't even deliver the drug in the first place. So you're actually introducing more risk than you're actually fixing. So you have to be very careful when you're doing risk control that it's giving you real benefit. It's actually reducing the right risk, so that the risks that are really severe and are going to cause harm to patient, that they're the ones that you're going after. But you can actually do something about it, and it is actually viable. It's not going to be a pie in the sky that will chase this process of reducing these risks, and it's never going to come to fruition because it's not economically viable.
Let's go through the next couple slides a little bit faster, since we have about 15 minutes left. And I know we have some really great examples at the end.
No problem. Risk acceptance. So this we again, myself and David and Ashley talked about this the other day. Sometimes a risk is just there; it's inherent in the process. You design this new process. And I think the example we used yesterday, guys, was a single-use bioreactor where you have a liner, and that can be thrown away. So sometimes that might introduce a risk of a tear in the liner, but we accept that because it's such a novel new process, and it's a wonderful way of eliminating the need to worry about cleaning validation, and worrying about elemental impurities, and worrying about all of these things that could leach into our products. We make our product in that single-use bioreactor, we throw away the liner, and the next time we use it, we bring in a fresh liner, and we don't have to worry about all of that cleaning, validation, etc. So there is a risk because of this new process that liner might tear, but we're willing to accept that because it's just a better process, So acceptance sometimes is something that we do. If you jump to
that next slide, Charlie, the next slide will also, I think, help jump that out, because they really tie together, right? Where you are, I have this. I've done all kinds of stuff to reduce, and I still have one that's a little yucky. Am I okay with that? Kind of what you were just saying, right? So,
exactly, and it's right on the line. We have that dark blue line, and it's just above it. But if we do something to eliminate this risk, we're probably going to introduce 2 or 3 others, because sometimes when you do risk mitigation, you introduce more risk as a result. So
and people will apply
when you weigh everything up together, it's better to actually just accept that one risk.
Yep. Benefit risk analysis is another phrase, if anyone hasn't used it before, to look into it. Do the benefits of this product, person, device, machine, part outweigh the risks? And we joked yesterday with Ashley as well about, well, that unacceptable risk is the fact that I'm poisoning my lips, but I'm willing to accept injecting the Botox because then I look beautiful on TV, right? So, there's that, the risk does not always have to be reduced to some happy low number, right? Because in many chemotherapy, poisons and harms, a lot of harm to you, right? Lots of harm, but it's acceptable risk because the benefits outweigh if they do.
Yeah.
So
Chemo and Botox are great examples because essentially what you're doing is poisoning your body
you're
to
causing
get
harm. Yep.
Yeah, you're deliberately poisoning your body to try and get a result that you want out of it. That could be either reducing the wrinkles around your eyes,
Yeah, but
or
Charlie, you
killing the
you don't
cancer
need that
cells that
though.
are actually making you even more sick.
You're naturally beautiful, so you don't have to worry about that. Come on. But yes, I do think the benefit risk analysis is a big part of it. We don't explicitly write the phrase here, but it's worth looking into, because when someone says, how far do you work to control the risk? Until you've done it enough. What's enough? Well, it depends on the benefits. If I reduce this risk anymore, then I can't sell a product to help people with broken arms. Well, that's not acceptable society, right? So I'm willing to have myself get a bit of a rash from the cast and discomfort with the cast because it's helping my bone heal. Whatever.
Yeah.
I think we covered that.
Absolutely. Yep.
Very good. And then the last step in the ICH-Q9 diagram there, as we can see, is risk review. So we should have mechanisms in place to regularly review our risks. Do we have it built into our quality management process, for example, or do we have dedicated risk management review meetings, maybe quarterly? The senior management team gets round the central risk register and go, okay, what are we going to go after? And have we introduced any changes that now mean we have to pull out the PFMEAs or the process FMEAs or the product FMEAs for particular products because we've either reformulated or we've changed, reactors, or we've done some change in the process. So review is a mechanism to review or monitor events. And that should be established. New product, new knowledge as well. So has the guidance changed? Or is there new techniques out there? The example I used there of single-use bioreactors, that was unheard of 20 years ago, the technology didn't exist. And then it came into existence. So without companies looking at risk review and looking at these new technologies, new technical processes that are available, we wouldn't bring them into our companies. Frequency of review should be based on the level of the risk, and it should include reconsideration of risk acceptance decisions. So just because we accepted a risk before, there might be new technology available that might allow us to safely reduce that risk now without having knock-on consequences. So always, I think, David, you said it yesterday, it should definitely not be something that gathers dust on a shelf. Every risk assessment, every PFMEA, any formalized risk assessment that you do should be a living, breathing document for the entire life cycle of the product.
Absolutely.
Risk management tools. Again, we could do a whole webinar on this.
Yeah.
We could take you through HACCP, we could take you through, cumulative frequencies. We could take you through process FMEAs, the whole bit. CCRAs from Annex, from the Udrelix Annex 1. I could keep going on. ICHQ3D, that's a risk assessment process. All of these kind of things.
We'll move on from this slide because we can always reach out for more information on this.
Exactly, yeah. You're going to want to go to a whole other webinar if you want to see the tools as well.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to do a ICHQ9 part 2, more intermediate course next.
Absolutely. So gearing towards efficiency. So you've implemented your quality risk management process, and it should allow for a top-down approach. an entity, so a system, a plant, or a process should be verified in its completeness first before detailing the analysis. And if any non-negligible risks are evidence from the whole entity, the risk assessment process should focus on the elements of an entity. It's not just a GXP thing. David, did you want to talk about this slide as well, or?
No, I'm happy. I completely agree. And remember, it does start at the top with management responsibility and oversight, right? And if someone is going to be a decision maker, you better not only have the tools like good QMS stuff, but the people who are trained. We didn't talk about that a lot, but you can't just say, hey, go do this risk analysis. So there's training, and there's records of training, and there's refresher training, and there's who's skilled to do what, and do you use experts, and when do you rely upon scientific literature, and does the management have oversight and care, because they're the names on the submission at the end, right?
Yeah, and when we say top down, we get into the discussions then around quality culture as well. I mean,
yeah.
is top down quality culture is our senior management living and breathing this? Are they talking the talk and walking the walk? Are they saying, we've noticed a change in the fauna in a particular grade C compounding suite. Maybe we should pull out the cross-contamination risk assessment. Maybe we should get everybody in. If you're seeing that coming from senior management and they're talking risk, they're talking, and it's not just risk, it's any kind of quality process. Then you've got the right quality culture. And if they're not, they're like, it's not an issue, they're brushing it under the carpet, then there could be an issue with the quality culture within the organization.
Well, that's when your CEO could become your CJO, your Chief Jailable Officer. So yes, it starts at the top.
Absolutely. So why do we use a risk-based approach? So if we have a centralized risk register and we're always going after the high risks, and even within an individual risk assessment, if we're looking at all the high risk scores that from that, we're targeting the resources at the right areas. So maybe it's a cross-contamination risk assessment identifies that the screening between, or the gowning entry between a class D and a class C area isn't big enough, then you're focusing the resources on that. You're then building that into the bigger picture, into the plans for the cyclical refurbishment of the plant, and you're going after the right things. Where all the risks are. If you're following it, living it, breathing it every day, everybody will be mindful of, that gowning area between that class C and class D, we have to be very careful of that. Maybe we have interim control measures where we never have more than 2 people in there at once, and we have increased cleaning and all of this kind of stuff, and an ultimate goal of redevelopment. We're going to knock that in to one bigger area. We're going to knock it in with the materials entry, and we're going to create a new materials entry area then at a different place, and we're going to improve. And it's a springboard for business processes. I mean, if you're improving your products, you're improving your process, you're improving your facility, it makes you a more, it just improves business processes as well. It makes that plant where you're manufacturing that biodrug or whatever, it makes it more attractive to companies to come and say, well, we want to place, we want to use you as our contractor because you've gone out, you've got state of the art, you've fixed all your problems, you've consistently shown that you've reduced risk over the year.
Agreed.
Perfect. And now in these next couple slides are going to be great because I'm going to answer many of the questions that have kept coming up about some examples. So we have only 5 more minutes. So I'm going to let you guys talk about these, but just giving you a time count. But I think talking about the risk in these examples are going to really answer a lot of the.
And I don't think these are not meant to be exhaustive in any way, but we did want to give us a couple more. You saw early on where Charlie had some of the what we'll call facility type or supplier type risk, and we mentioned others. So here's actually an example of what may typically be called product risk assessment. That's another acronym you may or may not use where you are at. But in this case, I hope you can read it. It may be a little tough, but you can almost, some people might call this a UFMEA, a use FMEA, and other people might call it sometimes like use error analysis or human factor study. Again, nomenclature. But the idea here is if you look, you're seeing that each row is something that they don't like that could happen, right? And if you look at that second column, the code, it says the first few say product recognition. So here somebody or a team is analyzing what might happen at the actual use level of the patient. In this case, maybe it's a tablet, actually taking the tablet and putting it in their mouth, right? And you can see the very first row says, hey, the product may look similar to another product. What might happen, the hazardous situation, they might take the wrong pill, right? And you, in the column, the two columns over, what's the effect or the harm? That one, the first row says missed dose, and your disease condition worsens, right? And what do we do about that right now? The current controls. Well, we have printed instructions, instructions for use. This is what you're supposed to do. And we verify that as you can see our policies about labeling, blah, 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 right? And if you watch that first row from left to right, by the time it gets to L, the risk says yellow acceptable. They've done this analysis, say, we're okay. It's very unlikely that people are going to mix it up and get worse. So we don't have to do any further work. We don't need any more risk controls. Whereas if you look at the third row, you will see there it says product looks similar, wrong product. Maybe for some reason they say that could trigger something worse, right? And maybe it's red. I'm not going to read it all. But the idea behind this is just to give you a little bit of a peek of, I think I even have the red in the wrong row, but it gives you a little bit of peek of what an actual exercise might look like at a product risk assessment level. And you see a hazard, a situation, a harm, you see a control, you see these probabilities and severities, you see this risk that's yellow or red or something, you see this rationale on the right or the justification of why we believe this is acceptable. And just simple example, and people will call it a lot of things, but it's kind of putting together some of what we're talking about here. You can go to the next. All right, so if you look at this next slide here, we just jumped down over to the process side, because someone I think also asked about patient versus process. People often call this criticality analysis, right? It's an area where I'm trying to analyze, can I make my manufacturing process? Maybe you have a recipe, do this, do this, do this, right? So again, not going to read all of it, but gets pretty complicated. Across the top, that you see the orange box says purity, process related impurities. Below that, you'll see those vertical text. Those are critical quality attributes that, the residual protein A is very important that we keep that where it needs to be. And then the lower rows near the bottom, you can see it says a just product there in the yellow, and then it says pH. And then you see all kinds of numbers and things. So this is a case of where at the process side, they're literally stepping through and saying, if this pH varies at this process step outside of the proven operating range or outside of some target, what effect might it have on something like that residual protein A? And how tightly do we have to monitor pH? Do we have to send pH for constant analytical testing? Or is it going to be controlled by the process? And if you jump to the next slide, the last one of this, just want to quickly give you the example, you'll see here, still part of the process. This is part of what you might call a control strategy. You heard the words before: strategies, controls, etc. Again, not going to read all the columns, but here we're saying we're looking at, this is probably about 0.01% of the size of a real control strategy. And they're looking at each row saying each of these possible causes or things that could cause trouble on a critical quality attribute that we really care about how severe is it if that thing drifts off spec? How likely is it to drift off spec? There's your detectability near the right. There's a column in blue closer to the right. How likely are we to notice there's a problem before it's too late and we have to throw out the batch, right? And you'll see there's my risk, and there's some color codes, and then I have justification and all that. So hopefully they're a little bit useful, just to give you a little extra little teaser about some, what does some of the stuff look like when people are actually doing it, right? They're not meant to be exact for you, right? Just teasers.
Yeah.
Awesome. These are fantastic questions and examples. So thank you so much, David and Charley. We have so many questions, but unfortunately we have filled up the entire 90 minutes. However, this has been recorded. We'll get a copy of this recording along with the presentation in the next couple of days. So you will be able to rewatch this presentation, take notes on that PDF that will also be sent to you. And all of this information right here will be shared. So you can reach out to David, you can reach out to Charley, myself, or Jan in Qualistry for some further information. A lot of these questions I hope were answered throughout the presentation. I know we didn't get to every single one. I'm thinking maybe we should do some type of a cheat sheet, a PDF guide. I don't know what you guys think, Charley and David, of FAQ type of thing. So I think that actually might be helpful. I've done that in the past with other webinars because just the substantial amount of questions is impossible to get to in 90 minutes or less. But do you guys have any parting last words before I pass it back over to Jan?
No, I'm happy. Thank you for inviting me. Happy to talk to anyone. I know with Charley, LinkedIn, email, neither one of us are trying to sell you, but if you really do want to do something with us, we're happy to do that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'd say the same thing. We sometimes get approached to do risk assessments. I might not be as digital as David. I might be a bit more old school with Excel sheets and Word documents, but yeah, I mean, we have tools as well for some of the excipients and the elemental impurity type risk assessments. So more than happy to help anyone who's on the webinar with anything they want. Really pleasure being here today, and thanks very much, Jan and Ashley, for inviting me as well.
Thank you.
I know it was a last minute change of personnel, so appreciate you're asking me to step in.
Absolutely.
And you look just as good live here as you do on your image on the slide.
Yes.
That's when I worked in Allergan and I was getting a bit more Botox then.
Great. So that was an amazing interactive. Thank you, David. Thank you, Charley. Actually, it was an amazing interactive presentation. Great comments, great questions from our audience. Thank you very much for showing up.